My sister Diane slid a single sheet of paper across the conference table and said, "Marcus doesn't count." Just like that. Our brother, the man who'd driven our dad to every doctor's appointment for 2 years, who'd shown up at midnight when the furnace broke, who had been there more than any of us, and Diane wanted to cross his name off the list like he was a clerical error. Let me back up. My dad, Robert Calloway, died on a Thursday morning in late February. He was 71. He'd been a high school shop teacher for most of his working life, and after he retired, he spent his weekends restoring furniture in the garage and watching college football with whoever happened to show up at the door. He was not a rich man by any stretch, but he'd been careful his whole life. He owned his house outright. He had about $180,000 in savings and a $95,000 IRA. He had roughly $40,000 worth of tools, woodworking equipment, and 2 classic trucks out in the garage. And he had a rental property on Elm Street that he'd bought back in 1998 for $62,000, and that had grown to somewhere around $310,000. Total estate, roughly $625,000 before taxes and fees. Not a fortune, but enough to matter depending on how it got divided. He had 3 biological kids, me Danny, 44 years old, my brother Nate, 42, my sister Diane, 38, and he had Marcus, 35, who my parents adopted when Marcus was 4 years old. My mom's college roommate had been killed in a car accident and left Marcus with nobody, so my parents brought him home. That was 1993. Marcus had been our brother for 31 years. My mom passed in 2014. After that, my dad became the center of gravity for the whole family. Sunday phone calls every week without fail, Christmas Eve at his house every single year. He made a point of telling each of us what we meant to him. When I was younger, that used to embarrass me a little. I'd give anything to hear it now. The last real conversation I had with him was about 3 weeks before he died. A Sunday night call. He was in a talkative mood. He mentioned the Elm Street property, said a tenant had offered to buy it and he was considering it, but probably not. Then he said something I wrote down afterward because something about the way he said it made me want to remember it exactly. He said, "I want everything split 4 ways, Danny. Make sure Marcus gets his piece. He's mine just as much as the rest of you." I said, "Dad, you have a will for that." He said, "I know, I'm just saying it to you too." I should have asked more questions. I didn't. The will he'd had on file since 2009 did exactly what he said. 4-way split, me, Nate, Diane, and Marcus each got 25%. The house, the savings, the IRA, the rental property, all of it. The will had been drafted by an attorney named Gerald Foss and witnessed by 2 people from Dad's church. It was clean and unambiguous. That was the will I knew about. The funeral was March 2nd. Marcus flew in from Portland. He was wrecked, more visibly broken than any of the rest of us, probably because he and Dad had stayed the closest after Mom died. He was the one who drove Dad to appointments. He was the one who answered the phone at 11 at night when something went wrong at the house. He'd been there in ways none of the rest of us had managed. I keep thinking about a moment before the service started. Marcus walked up to the casket alone while the rest of us were in the back accepting condolences. He stood there for a long time with his hand on the edge of the casket, not crying, not saying anything, just standing there. I watched him from across the room and thought, that man showed up for our father in every way that mattered. At the reception afterward at Diane's house, I noticed her and Nate kept slipping outside together, whispering. I figured it was grief or logistics. I was wrong. The will reading was scheduled for March 9th at the offices of a firm called Halstead and Birch. I'd never heard of them. When I asked Diane who they were, she said Dad had switched attorneys. I asked when. She said recently. That word hit me wrong. I didn't push it. I should have. 6 of us sat around the conference table that morning. Me, Nate, Diane, Marcus, our cousin Pam, named as a small sentimental beneficiary for Dad's old watch collection, and a woman named Teresa from the firm. Teresa read the will. It was dated November 14th, 11 weeks before Dad died. The split, 1/3 to Nate, 1/3 to Diane, 1/3 to me. Marcus got nothing. Not even the $500 acknowledgement the 2009 will had included by name for every family member. Marcus went completely still. He didn't say a word. I said, "That's not right." Diane said, "That's the legal will, Danny." I asked what happened to the 2009 will, and that's when she slid that piece of paper across the table, a single typewritten page claiming Marcus, as an adopted child, had no legal or moral claim to the biological estate of Robert Calloway, and that the November will reflected Dad's true wishes. Teresa looked uncomfortable when I asked about it. She said it wasn't part of the estate documents. I looked at Nate. He looked at the table. I looked at Diane. She looked straight at me. I picked up my copy of the November will, folded it, put it in my jacket pocket, and said we were done for the day. Marcus and I sat in my rental car in the parking garage for 45 minutes. He kept saying he didn't want to make a scene. He said he didn't want money to blow up the family. He said he'd just accept it. I told him that Dad had said, 3 weeks before he died, 4 ways, and that he'd said Marcus's name. I told him I wasn't going to let Diane erase him. He said, "Danny, I don't want you to." I said, "Marcus, stop. This isn't about what you want me to do. This is about what's right." He went quiet and looked out the window at the concrete walls of the parking garage for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "He used to call me his bonus kid. Did you know that? When I was little, said he got a bonus kid and that made him luckier than most." He stopped. I just keep thinking about that. I didn't say anything useful. I just started the car. That was March 9th. By March 11th, I was on the phone with an estate attorney named Carol Reeves, who a colleague had recommended. I walked her through the whole thing. She said the first thing we needed was the 2009 will and any documentation of what had happened between 2009 and November 14th. The 2009 will wasn't hard to get. Gerald Foss, the original attorney, was still practicing. I called his office, explained who I was, and asked for a copy. His assistant called me back within the hour. I had it emailed to Carol by noon. The 2 witnesses from the church, a woman named Edna Marsh, 74, and a man named Calvin Pierce, 68, were both reachable through the church directory. Both remembered signing. Both agreed to provide written statements. Then I started working backward on November 14th. My dad had been diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia in September, about 6 weeks before the new will was signed. I didn't know this until I started making calls. His GP, Dr. Hearn, couldn't share specifics without a formal release, but he told me in general terms that any legal document signed after a dementia diagnosis would face scrutiny around testamentary capacity. I knew then that we had something real to work with. I called Diane on March 14th and asked her directly if she'd known about the dementia when the new will was signed. She said, "That's none of your business." I said, "Who drove Dad to Halstead and Birch?" She hung up. Nate called me an hour later. He wasn't angry exactly, more defensive. He said Diane had been the one handling everything, dealing with the hard stuff while I was 3 states away. He said the new will was what Dad wanted and I should respect it. I told him about the Sunday phone call, the one where Dad had specifically said 4 ways and specifically named Marcus. Nate went quiet, then said, "Diane says he was confused a lot toward the end." I said, "Nate, he wasn't confused when he said Marcus's name." Nate said he wasn't going to fight his own family in court. I told him I understood and that I was doing this with or without him. Carol Reeves filed a will contest in probate court on March 28th. The grounds were 2-pronged: lack of testamentary capacity due to the dementia diagnosis, and undue influence by Diane, who had driven Dad to and from Halstead and Birch, and as I was now learning, had been present in the room when the will was signed. That last part came from Teresa. She called Carol's office voluntarily in early April. She said she'd been troubled by the signing. She said Diane had answered several questions that were directed at my dad. She said Dad had seemed uncertain and had looked to Diane before signing. She said the 2 paralegals who witnessed it had not been told there was an existing 2009 will. That statement changed everything. When I told Marcus about it over the phone one night in April, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need you to know I'm grateful, whatever happens." I said, "Don't thank me yet." Meanwhile, Diane and Nate had already applied to have themselves named co-executors under the November will. They'd also contacted the Elm Street tenant and told her the property would be sold as soon as probate closed. The tenant, who'd lived there for 9 years, called me in a panic because she'd found my number in old lease paperwork where Dad had listed me as an emergency contact. That call made me sick. On top of that, Diane had transferred $14,000 from a joint checking account she'd held with Dad. The account had been set up for practical bill-paying purposes while she was helping him manage finances in his last year. The money was gone before probate even opened. Carol added that to the filing. Nate called me after learning about the court filing. He was upset now. He said I was dragging the family through court over someone who wasn't even blood. That phrase stopped me cold. I'd never heard Nate talk like that about Marcus. I said, "He's been your brother for 31 years. Nate said, "You know what I mean." I said, "No, say it plainly so I'm sure I understand." He didn't. He just said this was going to cost everyone money and goodwill and wasn't worth it. I said it was worth it to me, and I ended the call. Diane escalated from her end. On April 12th, she sent a message to the extended family group chat. About 22 people, including aunts, uncles, cousins, and Dad's 2 surviving siblings, laying out her version of events. She said Dad had been clear that he wanted to leave his estate to his biological children. She said Marcus had been provided for by a separate inheritance from his biological family and didn't need the money. She said I was contesting the will not out of principle, but because Marcus had manipulated my peacemaker tendencies. The part about Marcus having a separate inheritance from his biological family was a flat lie. His mother had died with nothing. Diane had been at that funeral in 1993. She knew exactly what she was saying. About half the group chat went quiet. The other half started talking. My Aunt Beverly, Dad's older sister, sent me a private message that night. She said she knew Dad loved Marcus and she thought Diane was wrong, but she didn't want to get in the middle of it. I understood. I wasn't going to hold it against her. My cousin Pam sent a longer message. She said she'd been bothered by the will reading from the start, and then she told me something I hadn't known. Diane had called her the night before and told her to be cool and not react when Marcus's name wasn't in the will. Pam hadn't thought much of it at the time. After the filing, she realized what it meant. Diane had known in advance exactly what that will said and had been stage managing the room. I forwarded Pam's message straight to Carol Reeves. Marcus's one real ally in the family group chat was our cousin Reggie, 44 years old, Nate's age, had grown up spending summers at our dad's house. 2 days after Diane's message, Reggie posted about 12 lines. The last one was, "Robert Calloway called Marcus his son for 31 years. I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it." Diane removed Reggie from the group chat. Reggie called me that same evening, laughing a little despite everything. He said, "I figured she'd do that." He offered to write a statement for the court. I said that would be helpful. He sat down that week and wrote a detailed 2-page account, including a specific moment from Christmas 2022 where Dad had pointed at the 4 of us, me, Nate, Diane, Marcus, and said to Reggie, "Those are my 4 kids. Don't let anyone tell you different." Holiday invites came next. Nate's wife, Sandra, texted me in April to let me know, gently, that Easter at their house would probably be weird given the circumstances. She wasn't mean about it. She was just managing her household. Marcus didn't get an invite either. Nate texted him directly, at least he did it himself, and just said it was going to be a small thing this year. Marcus called me after getting that text. He said, 31 years, Danny. I said, I know. There was nothing else to say. The probate hearing was scheduled for June 17th. In the 8 weeks between filing and the hearing, Carol assembled a solid body of documentation. We had the 2009 will from Gerald Foss's files, signed witness statements from Edna Marsh and Calvin Pierce, Teresa's written account of the November 14th signing, Dr. Hearn's records, obtained through a properly filed discovery request, showing the September dementia diagnosis and clinical notes documenting Dad's declining capacity in October and November, the $14,000 transfer records, Pam's account of Diane's pre-reading phone call, Reggie's Christmas 2022 statement, and the notes I'd written down the night of my Sunday call with Dad, which I'd emailed to myself the same evening, giving them a clear timestamp. Diane had retained her own attorney, a man named Frank Ostrowski who had a solid track record in county family estate work. Nate was represented by the same attorney as a secondary party. Their response argued that testamentary capacity and undue influence were high bars to clear, that early-stage dementia doesn't render someone legally incapacitated, and that Diane had simply been helping Dad accomplish his genuine wishes. The hearing itself was not dramatic the way courtrooms look on television. It was a Tuesday morning in June, county courthouse, fluorescent lights, and a judge named Patricia Whalen who had clearly seen versions of this story before. She was patient but completely businesslike. Ostrowski made his points calmly. Early-stage dementia. Dad had been driving himself until December. He'd managed his own finances with some assistance. The law presumes competence unless you can prove otherwise. Carol presented Teresa's account of the signing in full. Teresa had submitted a sworn affidavit and was there in person to testify. She described Diane answering questions directed at my dad, Dad looking to Diane for guidance before signing, and her own discomfort that she hadn't acted on at the time. Ostrowski cross-examined her and tried to establish that Dad had simply been nervous or tired. Teresa held firm. She said she'd been present at hundreds of will signings, and this one had been different. Dr. Hearn's records were the backbone of the whole case. His notes from October 15th, 1 month before the signing, described Dad as showing significant short-term memory loss and difficulty with multi-step decision-making. There was also a section where he'd recommended Dad not enter into any major financial or legal agreements without a family advocate review. Judge Whalen asked Ostrowski to address those notes directly. He argued that family advocate didn't mean a neutral party, that Diane was a family advocate, and that the doctor's recommendation wasn't a legal bar. Then Judge Whalen put Diane on the stand. She asked whether Diane had told the attorneys at Halstead and Birch about the dementia diagnosis before the signing. Diane said she hadn't thought it was relevant. The judge looked at her, just a beat of silence. Then she asked whether Diane had explained to Dad that he was replacing a previous will, whether Dad had understood he was signing something that would remove Marcus entirely. Diane said she had explained it to him. The judge asked if anyone from Halstead and Birch had independently asked Dad about prior wills. Teresa, still in the room, said they had asked the standard question. She said Dad had told them he didn't remember having a prior will. That answer landed hard. Carol let it sit for 2 full seconds before her next question. Before we broke, Judge Whalen had one last question. She looked at Diane and asked, "Did your father ever in your presence say that Marcus was not to receive a share of the estate?" Diane said yes. She said Dad had told her Marcus had other resources and that the biological children should keep what the family had built. The judge nodded and wrote something down. I glanced back at Marcus sitting in the gallery. He was watching Diane with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not anger exactly, something more like grief over something that couldn't be undone. He'd grown up in that family. He'd shoveled that driveway, eaten at that table, borrowed those tools and returned them and borrowed them again. And his sister had just sat in a courtroom and described him as a financial afterthought. I turned back to face front before he caught me looking. The written decision came on July 14th, 37 days after the hearing. Judge Whalen found insufficient evidence to invalidate the November will on testamentary capacity alone. She was clear that early-stage dementia does not automatically constitute legal incapacity and that the bar is high. But she found substantial evidence of undue influence. She cited Teresa's testimony about Diane answering questions on Dad's behalf, the failure to disclose the 2009 will to the Halstead and Birch attorneys, the absence of independent counsel for Dad at the signing, and the timing relative to the dementia diagnosis. The November will was invalidated. The 2009 will was declared the controlling document. Four-way split, 25% each. She also ordered a full accounting of the $14,000 Diane had transferred and ruled that amount was to be included in the estate and deducted from Diane's share before distribution. I called Marcus at 11:30 in the morning when I got the decision. He was at work. I said, "We won." He was quiet for a second, then I heard him step away from whatever room he was in. He said, "Are you serious?" I said, "Judge invalidated the November will. The 2009 will stands. You get your 25%. A 35-year-old man crying on the phone does not feel like winning. It feels like the full weight of what almost happened. After fees and estate administration costs, 25% of that $625,000 estate worked out to roughly $143,000 for each of us. Diane's $14,000 was deducted from her share first, so she received about $129,000. The Elm Street property took a few months to resolve. The tenant decided she wanted to try to buy it after all, got a loan together, and purchased it in October for $298,000. A fair deal for everyone. Dad always liked that tenant. He would have been glad it worked out that way. Marcus used part of his share to pay off the last $31,000 on his student loans and put the rest into savings. He told me he was going to take a week off and drive down the coast, something he and Dad had always talked about doing together but never got around to. I told him to take a picture of the water and send it to me. Nate and I have not spoken since the ruling. Sandra sent me a text in August that said she was sorry for how everything went and she hoped we could find our way back eventually. I told her I hoped so too and left it there. Diane didn't contact me at all. Ostrowski sent a letter on her behalf exploring whether there were grounds for appeal. Carol reviewed it and said there weren't strong ones. As of November, no appeal had been filed. Reggie and I had dinner in September when he was passing through town. He brought a six-pack of the IPA our dad used to drink, and we sat on my back porch and talked about the old man for 3 hours. That was the best night I'd had in a long time. My Aunt Beverly sent me a handwritten card in October. She said she thought I'd done the right thing. She said Robert would have been proud. I kept the card. Here's what I keep coming back to. Diane knew Marcus her whole life. She was at his birthday parties. She was there the day Mom brought him home. She heard Dad call him his son hundreds of times across 31 years. She knew the 2009 will. She knew about the Sunday phone calls. She knew every single thing that made Dad's intentions clear. And she sat in that law office with a man who was losing his memory and helped him sign a document that erased her brother. I don't know what math she was doing in her head. Maybe she convinced herself she'd earned more because she'd been the one showing up. Maybe she'd quietly resented Marcus for not being biological for 31 years and finally let it out. Maybe she just wanted the money. I'll probably never know. What I know is what my dad said on a Sunday phone call 3 weeks before he died. 4 ways. Make sure Marcus gets his piece. He's mine just as much as the rest of you. I'm his son too, so I made sure. If you were sitting in my seat that day in the parking garage, what would you have done? Drop it in the comments. I read every one.